My task is to talk about Baptists and the limits of liberty. Um, for Baptists, someone like Roger Williams usually needs no introduction. Williams, of course, was the founder of the Providence Plantations, or what eventually became Rhode Island. Williams didn't found those settlements voluntarily. He himself fled Massachusetts because of his religious beliefs, seeking to establish a colony for, as he said, persons distressed of conscience. And after its inception, Providence and the surrounding communities that made up the colony all enacted disestablishment, severing any formal ties between the civil and ecclesial spheres. Williams was somewhat unique for his time. He not only defended concepts like religious liberty theoretically, but he had the opportunity to secure it as a political reality. Throughout his career, Williams contended that religious liberty was not only a theological imperative, especially considering his soteriological and ecclesiological commitments, but it was also the surest means, by his estimation, to secure societal peace and flourishing, at least in theory. Though Williams was a Baptist for all of 12 minutes, Williams is ensconced in the Baptist tradition and even the broader American political tradition on the issue of religious liberty. Baptists like Isaac Backus and John Leland, who advocated for freedom of conscience in the late colonial and early republic periods, copiously cited Williams and his works on religious liberty. And if you fast forward throughout our tradition, in getting into the 20th century, Williams populated the minds and served as something of an intellectual foundation for the leading Baptist figures on issues of conscience. Williams's writings have been cited in a Supreme Court case, and he is the subject of numerous books on the issue of conscience. But the story of Williams is instructive for our purposes on religious liberty, especially as we think about the role of history in informing our present-day beliefs and convictions. Here is a very important historical precept that I want to draw out. The way we remember the past is at times as important or even more important than the actual events themselves. When it comes to Williams, he is remembered in ways that would have scandalized even this 17th century religious radical. He is held up in scholarly works as a paragon for religious equality and heralded as the progenitor of a secularized public square devoid of religiously based arguments. Baptists in the 20th century, moreover, wielded Williams and his works on the freedom of conscience to justify doctrinal capitulation within denominational structures, and to justify, and again, this is amongst Baptists in the 1960s and 70s, to justify a pro-choice ethic on abortion. Again, how we remember the past is at times just as important as the events and people themselves. And to state the obvious, Williams, to my knowledge, had nothing to say about abortion. He certainly in no way believed in something like religious equality, nor did he apply his concept on the conscience as a license for theological ambiguity or error within churches. Williams, furthermore, had a lot to say about the limits of religious liberty during his career, providing yet another historical insight that ought to give us much to reflect on in our contemporary disputes about religious liberty. Our convictions and resolves, especially how we apply them, like Williams's conviction that religious establishment was doctrinally destitute and politically perilous, are often more malleable than we realize, subject to context, including trials and experience. For Williams, his views on religious liberty subtly changed over time as he tried to govern what he called a licentious and contentious people. Indeed, if religious liberty, as Williams argued in many of his works, was the surest means for societal peace and flourishing, the story of early Rhode Island belied that axiom. From its inception, the Providence plantations were anything but peaceful. Disputes were frequent, they often turned violent, they broke out into mobs, and in at least one case left a man dead. The colonists, including Williams, actually pinned their troubles on the lack of religious establishment and the failure of their communities of banished misfits to successfully organize a church. Nothing held the people together. There was no unifying ideal or purpose like what they would have had in Congregational Massachusetts. Letters from the 1640s and 50s spoke of the sweet cup of liberty that had been too much for the colony and its colonists. One leading colonist decried his community, saying that liberty of conscience had invited all the scum of the earth to take up residence. Williams himself tried to hold the colony together, a task that he nearly failed at doing in the early 1640s and 50s. Williams's first major work on religious liberty was, of course, his Bloody Tenet of Persecution. This work and its sequel, the aptly named The Bloody Tenet, Yet More Bloody, provided Williams's robust defense of religious liberty as not only a political cure to the religious wars that had besieged Europe over the last 30 years and had caused the English Civil Wars, but he also rooted disestablishment in theological and natural law categories. His main argument was that God did not require uniformity of religion that was enforced via the mechanisms of the state. It was these two works that are often cited and part of our historical memory with regard to Williams. But it's his lesser known works that came later in his life that provide evidence of subtle shifts in his thinking, where he began to articulate clear limits with regard to religious liberty, as well as a positive relationship between the magistrate and the church. Indeed, in the 1650s, Williams argued in several tracts that the magistrates were to be nursing fathers to the churches, channeling magisterial Protestant political theology of the time. He also came down against conscientious objection to serving in Rhode Island's militia. Many in the colony had sincerely held religious beliefs about taking a human life, and so did not want to be forced to serve in the colony's militia. But for Williams, this was way beyond the pale of toleration. More instructively, Williams's debate with the Quakers in 1672 was the culmination of a near decade-long political and religious struggle in the colony that left Williams seriously questioning whether any civil community could grant religious liberty to Quakers. Williams argued that the, quote, spirit of Quakers tends mainly to the reducing of persons from civility to barbarism, to an arbitrary government. Though he detested their theological beliefs, he had a central concern at how Quaker spirituality nourished a hyper-individualism that emphasized personal autonomy and baptized their behavior as commands coming directly from God. Such antics, Williams warned, destroyed fundamental mores necessary for communal solidarity. And he called for, quote, due and moderate restraint at punishing of these incivilities, though pretending as conscience. This, according to Williams, did not amount to persecution, but rather a, quote, duty and command of God unto all mankind. To be sure, Williams never gave up on religious liberty, but his experience in governing a contentious, unruly, unmoored people forced him to reconsider the limits of liberty, as well as the positive role that Christianity played in a society. And this was not only the case of Williams. Other Baptists throughout the tradition held, on the one hand, a steadfast commitment to disestablishment and freedom of conscience, while on the other hand, articulating concepts like liberty within a very specific context. Isaac Backus, for example, though pleading for religious liberty throughout his career, also approved religious tests for offices for those seeking to serve in Massachusetts' legislature. He, as one historian noted, quote, presented a picture of liberty grounded and rooted in the solidity of meaning provided by his context of human virtues, responsibilities, and aspirations. Even the famed speech by George Truett in 1920, which declared the Baptist commitment to religious liberty, included this warning: we are to be alertly watchful day and night that liberty, both religious and civil, shall nowhere be prostituted and mistreated. Every perversion and misuse of liberty tends by that much to jeopardize both church and state. So what does this mean for Baptists? First, as a historian, I plead for us to think rightly about history and to understand that how we remember the past is just as important as the events themselves. Presentist concerns can lead us to contort the historical record, forcing figures like Williams or Backus or anyone in our tradition to uphold a vision of liberty that they didn't even have a category for. Second, we also need to be mindful of how ideas were articulated within a particular context. Liberty in the 1600s meant something entirely different than liberty in the 21st century. It's anachronistic to colonize the past and historical ideas with our own preconceived notions and questions. But finally, I want to encourage us all to engage in our present disputes with charity, kindness, patience, and humility. The questions that faced Williams and others throughout our history were very difficult ones, and they failed to resolve them. And their questions remain unresolved, which leads to one final historical principle as we think about our history and our tradition. History ought to humanize us. It should remind us of our inability to solve complex problems and moral issues. The challenges we face today are numerous and will require deep, serious thinking as well as biblical conviction in an age of surrender. But joining all of that must be a deep sense of humility as brothers and sisters as we seek to bear one another's burdens, to contend for the faiths once for all delivered to the saints, and to bear a faithful testimony of the gospel to a lost and dying world.